Before giving you the results, I would like to insist on the fact that they are not reliable enough and make results of some artifact. Anyway, here are the main results. Ambitants are the best performers in the maze by far. Introversives and extratensives are equally performant during the learning phase, but not in the transfer situation. The extratensives get better performances. Apparently, the introversives in the maze do not transfer their knowledge. I think the best way to present the results is through the representations of the subjects. The introversive strategy rely on modelization of the problem. Their representation of the maze is a route. The advantage of this representation is that it handles few informations. It is a combination of signals identified in the maze and associated procedures, which means model representations. There are two inconveniences. First, the introversives are disturbed in their activity because the maze I built is noisy. The pencil used to go through the maze doesn't slide very well. This aspect is misleading for them because they try to identify the relevant signals. Unfortunately, they might miss one or take one for one another. When that happens, they try to activate the associated procedure, and it's a little drama. They just can't believe that they've made a mistake, so they repeat the same procedure several times. They have noticed that the maze is noisy, and they try to ignore that noise. If this noise appears to be a wall, they sometimes come to break it down. When they are sure that they got it wrong, they update the model, so the introversives do repeat their errors, but only in the same trial. The second inconvenience is that this model is hard to transfer when the maze is reversed. The introversives would have to reverse all the procedures, but the worst is that some signals may change. Indeed, dead-end types changes according to the way one takes the maze. This is all too complicated and demand too much resources, so the introversive prefers to make a new model when the maze is reversed. Actually, they do as many errors during the learning and the transfer phases. They do not reuse their knowledge. As a model, their representation of the maze is good enough, but it is not exact. So, they get mixed results for the drawings, and half of the final ones are correct. It is not the heart of the strategy. The results concerning the extratensives are misleading. Unlike the introversives, their behavior change in the transfer situation. They no longer repeat their errors, for example, and their performances are better than in the first phase. So we can think that they used some knowledge they get concerning the maze, but they got poor performances concerning the drawings. The important thing for them is to know how to get to one location to the next one. They proceed gradually, little by little. They don't pay too much attention to the global organization of those locations. That's why they get poor drawings. One uses this type of spatial navigation when he goes hiking. A good example can be found in fairy tales like Hop My Thumb. I think that the extratensive representation of the maze rely on the graph in the mathematical sense of the graph theory. The extratensives don't look for markers like the introversives, but for locations. These locations constitute the nodes of the graph. Once in a location, the extratensive know that some direction lead to another location, these are the arcs of the graph, or some other directions lead to the same location, and these are the loops. Once the extratensive manage to find the nodes, all he has to do is to identify the loops. You can see that this representation can be very helpful when the maze is reversed. They can find their way back without having a global representation for the maze. They're just like Theseus hanging on Ariana's thread. The ambitants focus on a global representation of the maze. This representation is more abstract than the two others. Indeed, the routes in the path contain elements from the real maze, markers and location respectively. There is no such thing about the map, it is a copy, a sketch of the real maze. Once the ambitent managed to get such an integrated and detached representation, he can easily play with it in his mind, or perform operations like reversing it. This is very clear to them when they are asked about that, there is no question about it, they seem to wonder if there is any other solution. So, their representation is the most efficient and they get the best performances. Moreover, in the transfer situation, they get the right drawings before succeeding in the maze, which is not the case for the two other groups. And finally, most of the final drawings are correct. To conclude, I would say that these results are consistent with the RCS data concerning the introversive and the extratensive style. On the contrary, we are very surprised by the performances of the ambitants. We found that their representation of the problems are not like the one of the introversive or the extratensive, but presents characteristics of its own. So we can put forward the hypothesis that ambitendency is a definite style. Anyway, the differences in the performances between the lab and the LAD is to be discussed and requires further researches. And finally, those results should be taken with great precautions since they are not very reliable. Thank you for your attention.